This video is about psychological safety, and when you look at psychological safety, it's creating that environment for employee engagement, learning, innovation, and growth. One of the foundations of psychological safety is creating an environment where everyone's voice matters. When people recognize or when people feel and believe that their voice matters, employee engagement goes up. Contribution to new ideas and creativity, it all increases. Now, this is really important because Gallup did a study on the American workforce, and what they found was that 3 in 10 employees agreed with the statement that they believed their opinion counted at work. That just means that 7 in 10 are not fully engaged in what they're doing. They also determined that if we could increase the ratio to 6 in 10. Now, Amy Edmondson, she's a professor at Harvard University, and she wrote a book called The Fearless Organization, which is the body that authorized or certified me to be a certified psychological safety coach and consultant. She says that psychological safety is the soil, not the seed. And what this really means is that psychological safety is the environment that will allow a culture and an organization to flourish. A brief definition, or I should say an initial definition of psychological safety, it is a shared belief held by members of a team that it is safe for interpersonal risk-taking without fear of retribution, being humiliated, or harshly criticized. Psychological safety does not always mean that people will agree with one another for the sake of being nice. It also does not mean that people who offer their ideas will not necessarily get unequivocal praise or unconditional support for everything they have to say. And this leads to an environment of radical candor. And this is what psychological safety really is about, is that concept, that idea, that culture where productive disagreements can occur, and those engagements also encourage a free exchange of ideas. So in many ways, we're looking at eliminating fear from the business environment. When you look at fear, there's a few components of fear that I want to touch upon. The first component is what we call dangerous silence. When people see something unsafe or wrong and they fear reporting it. People feel bullied and intimidated by someone, but they don't report it. Fear of speaking up can be hazardous to human health, which I'm going to show you in a moment. And all this fear can lead to widespread frustrations, anxiety, depression, and even physical harm. So here's a quick case study. I'm going to summarize it. This is about a hospital and a neonatal nurse, and she received new twins, and they were premature, and she was getting them put into the incubator and whatnot when the doctor showed up and looked at the baby, looked at the chart, and turned around and left. And Christina, the nurse, wanted to say something to him that he did not order a certain medication that's vital for premature babies so their lungs will develop, but she decided not to. And when she decided not to, we found out later because she saw this doctor dress down another nurse for questioning one of his orders or questioning why he didn't do something. Now, in this moment, Christina, she made a micro assessment, and she was weighing the difference between being dressed down by the doctor, which would happen immediately, and the potential risk to the babies, which would happen later on over the next few months. And in her mind, she admitted that she said, well, the doctor knows best, so he must know what he's doing. Now, if we were to turn this around and turn this into a psychologically safe environment, the doctor would have thanked Christina. He would have explained to her why he wasn't prescribing the medication, or he would acknowledge her for helping him remember that these babies did need that medication. Another form of psychological safety is workplace silence and what is not said. And this case study is about two 747s that crashed on the runway in 1977, killing all 583 people on board. And it involved a Pan Am plane and a KLM plane. The Pan Am plane was on the tarmac taxiing, and they didn't. And it was all fogged in, so they didn't know if the plane was on the runway or off the runway. But the pilot of the other airline decided that he was going to roll down the runway for takeoff. He started to accelerate. His first officer said, "Wait, we don't have ATC clearance, air traffic control clearance yet." And he said, "Yeah, you're right." So he radioed to ATC. ATC said, "Stand by," and then gave them the takeoff pattern. The pilot misunderstood that, put his throttles to full. Nobody spoke up because, after all, he was the captain. And when they went down the runway, they finally saw the KLM plane the Pan Am plane crossing the runway, and they couldn't pull up in time, and they struck the other plane, and everybody died. And because of that incident, the process and how orders are given and when they can take off or whatever they're going to do in the cockpit has changed, that both pilots have to agree. So in a psychologically safe workplace, people are not hindered by interpersonal fear. They feel willing and able to take inherent personal risks of candor. They fear holding back their full participation more than they fear sharing a potentially sensitive, threatening, or wrong idea. So the psychologically safe organization is one in which interpersonal fear is minimized so that team and organizational performance can be maximized in a knowledge-intensive world. What do we mean by that? We live in a VUCA environment, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Especially in your industry, things are changing so quickly. And the two lines that you see on the screen, the green one represents the change of technology, and the black line represents human development. And so there's a gap there. And the way that we close that gap is to make sure that we have an environment where sharing ideas and speaking up is encouraged without that fear. So how does psychological safety drive value and innovation? Well, Google did a study a couple of years ago, and they called it Project Aristotle, and they studied 180 teams. And they concluded that it's not enough just to have A players. What they discovered was that even the extremely smart and high-powered employees at Google needed psychologically safe work environments to contribute to the talents that they had to offer. The team also found other factors that helped explain team performance. Obviously, things like clear goals, dependable colleagues, personal meaningful work, and that they believe that their work has impact. But it really came down to psychological safety that made a difference. So when we look at this chart, what we see is how psychological safety crushes innovation. And we'll look at leadership, employees, and innovation. On the leadership side, what we're seeing is that psychological safety, if it's not present, leadership tends to be controlling and top down. When there is psychological safety in an environment, leadership tends to be more inquiring and bottom up and mission driven. Teams, they comply, they hide mistakes, and they maintain their reputation without psychological safety. And when psychological safety is part of the culture, they challenge ideas, they learn from their mistakes, and they serve the mission. Without psychological safety, innovation is stifled by the need to maintain status quo. And with psychological safety, everyone is encouraged to adapt and share and try new ideas. So when we envision psychological safety, it really can make a huge difference. And we learned about a couple different situations already. We learned that airplanes have crashed. We know that financial institutions have fallen because there was a lack of psychological safety, and hospital patients died unnecessarily because individuals were, for reasons having to do with the climate in which they worked, afraid to speak up. And the fear also led to disgruntled employees, workplace violence, and even strong measures such as depression and even suicide. So fortunately, it doesn't have to happen this way, and that's why I believe psychological safety is so important. Now, there's 4 steps to psychological safety, and we're going to work backwards from 4 to number 1. The fourth step is accountability, and we spoke briefly about this during our call when I mentioned above the line and below the line behavior and people being accountable for their behavior and, to some degree, the behavior of their colleagues. Number two is trust in your relationships. So this is developing interpersonal trust. Number two is effective communication between each other. And number one, of course, is self-mastery or emotional intelligence. When we assess a team on about the level of psychological safety, we're doing so on four core axes or domains. The first one is willingness to help. The second is inclusion and diversity, and we flip it on purpose because we believe that you have to have inclusion first before you can have diversity. Attitude towards risk and failure, and open conversations. Now, a typical engagement might look something like this on the screen, where before we begin any interventions or work, we would give the team the assessment, we would do a debrief with the team, and then we would do interventions. And at a specified intervals, we would give the assessment again to make sure that we're headed in the right track. And each time we would debrief with the team. So the assessment is really simple. It's 7 questions, takes less than 3 minutes to take the assessment. And the questions are, if you make a mistake on this team, it is often held against you. Number 2, members of this team are able to bring up problems and tough issues. Number 3, people on this team sometimes reject others for being different. Number 4, it is safe to take a risk on this team. Number 5, it is difficult to ask other members of this team for help. Number 6, no one on this team would deliberately act in a way that undermines my efforts. And number 7, working with members of this team, my unique skills and talents are valued and utilized. So I want to show you what the report looks like. This is a modified version of the report. What you're seeing on the screen right now is you see a orange box, and then you see a gray box before it, and then you see dots that are scattered. And each dot represents a person who took the assessment. I'm showing you this one because this shows the improvement that we made in a couple of month period. So the gray box was the original, and you can see that there's a grayed out dotted line going down in the middle, and that's the median score. And then the orange box represents the standard deviation. So this is the overall assessment for psychological safety. This particular one is an attitude toward risk and failure, which is very important for building a high performance team, and at the same time not being overly risk taking, but still be willing to take some risks. Open conversations. We can see we made a big improvement here over time, and we reduced the standard deviation. So we know that we're headed in the right direction. And there's a couple more pages to this report, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what that report looks like. So that's the end of my video. I hope this is valuable for you. Obviously, feel free to share it with whomever you'd like to.